Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, a series of chats with leading scholars in the field. With me today is Thomas Hegghammer, Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment in Oslo, and one of the leading scholars in the field of the global jihadist movement. Welcome to GW, Thomas.
Thanks very much.
I thought that we might begin our conversation by talking about Syria. And how does Syria fit into this broader research that you've been doing over the years on foreign fighters and the global jihadist movement? What's unique about Syria, and what do you see as typical about Syria?
Well, the key thing about Syria is the scale. So it's the biggest case of this phenomenon of Muslim foreign fighters. And this, of course, is a phenomenon that goes back some time, especially from the mid-80s onwards. You've had Islamists joining other Muslims' wars in various parts of the world, and sometimes moving on to other conflicts and becoming part of a sort of internationalist jihadi movement. Of course, different conflicts have attracted foreign fighter contingents of different sizes, different compositions, etc. And the unique thing about Syria is the scale, is the fact that it's the largest, it has the largest foreign fighter contingent of any previous conflict in the region.
Even larger than Iraq.
Oh yes, Iraq, according to my sources, probably didn't attract more than around 4,000 to 5,000 foreign fighters in total over the sort of the three, 4 main years of foreign fighters, foreign fighter flow. Syria already, barely 2 years, 3 years into the conflict, has at least 6,000 Sunni foreign fighters. It could be more, it could be 7,000, 8,000 in my view. And that's not counting the Shiite foreign fighters, who may be a similar number. Since the conflict doesn't show any sign of ending, I think we're looking at basically having by far the largest contingent.
Let's talk about let's talk about who these people are, how they get there, why they go there, and looking back to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to these other conflicts. What do you see that's new beyond just the scale? How do people decide that they're going to get up from their home in Libya and go fight in Syria?
Well, in terms of the composition of the contingent, the Syrian contingent is as transnational, as multinational as many of the other contingents. Perhaps the main distinctive feature is the European element, that you have a much larger number of Europeans in Syria, both in absolute numbers and as a proportion of all the foreign fighters. According to my numbers, there are more Europeans in Syria today than the total number of European foreign fighters in all of the previous destinations combined. And Europeans make up somewhere between 10 and 30% of all the Sunni foreign fighters in Syria, which is a remarkable proportion, because in most other conflicts they were just a tiny fraction of the overall contingent. In Iraq, for example, nothing suggests that they were ever more than 1 or 2% perhaps of the foreign fighters.
So why do you think that is?
I think it has much to do with ease of access. That it's basically much easier to get to Syria than it has been to most other foreign fighter destinations since Afghanistan in the 1980s. And why the ease of access? Well, one is geopolitics, that the foreign fighters are joining the side that most states, both in the region and in the West, are also supporting. So it's politically difficult for these states to crack down on outgoing foreign fighters. And then another key element is the fact that the rebels control territory in the north, and they control the Syrian side of the border. So there's nobody to police the border, to stop, that doesn't want foreign fighters in there. And in this, Syria is quite unique. In most other conflicts, you had some force policing the border that was hostile to foreign fighters. So, and then of course there's the geographical proximity to Europe. You can drive from northern Norway to Syria if you want.
Now, how seriously do you assess the risk that these foreign fighters, Europeans or Americans, will take their fight back home when this is over, or even before it's over? Do you think these are exaggerated fears, or do you think it's a serious risk?
Well, I've looked at the sort of blowback phenomenon from previous conflicts, and generally the number of Western foreign fighters who come back and perpetrate terrorist attacks is small. It's always just a small proportion of the outgoing ones. On average, it's at most sort of 1 in 9, 1 in 10, on average. Now, having said that, the return rate varies substantially between conflicts. Some destinations like AFPAC has tended to sort of send back a relatively large proportion of the incoming foreign fighters, whereas other destinations like Iraq only had a little bit of spillover in the West. The question, of course, then is, where will Syria fall on this sort of spectrum of return rates? Will it be a low blowback or a high blowback destination? And my work on this, so far is suggesting that the key variable that determines whether or not a conflict has a high blowback or not is the presence of an organization in theater that has a strategy of targeting the West. That is what you had in AFPAC after '96. That is what you have had to some extent in Yemen, which is another destination with a high blowback rate. And that is what you did not have in Iraq, for example, and many other destinations. And so far, we don't have it in Syria either. None of the organizations in theater have a strategy of targeting the West. They're focusing their struggle locally, despite, of course, some anti-Western rhetoric. So far, it looks like the blowback rate is going to be low, but the conflict is not over, and you never know when a group or a faction of a group may want to try out a new strategy.
Well, particularly when you now have the Western-backed rebel factions opening a new front and fighting against the jihadist groups. Does that increase the risk?
Yeah, so that's one possible scenario, that the al-Qaida linked groups might want to punish the backers of their local enemies. Another scenario is if you get, for example, a terrorist attack on the U.S. homeland or in Europe of a certain size, and politicians panic and point to the safe haven that you effectively have in Syria. In fact, now al-Qaida-linked groups have a sizable enclave in northern Syria, something that jihadis haven't had since the summer of 2001 in Afghanistan. And this may produce some type of military retaliation, in which case some of the local groups might respond to that. So there's a potential for escalation in case of an intervention. And then there's also the possibility that of sort of a bidding game where a faction in the insurgency is trying to wants to appear as more effective or radical or believing than the others, and tries to launch attacks in the West as a way to kind of gain stature within the jihadi community.
Let's move quickly beyond Syria. In about 6 or 7 years ago, you wrote a really good short article called Global Jihadism After Iraq. And you remember this one.
Yes.
So what of your forecasts at the time do you think turned out to be right? Which ones didn't work out quite so well, and why?
I think the one the one main mistake I and other analysts made about Iraq was to expect more spillover and more of a blowback effect than there really was. In the article, I expected a certain amount of spillover in the region, particularly in the Gulf. That only happened to a relatively small extent. But many people around 2003, 2004 expected an Afghanistan-like blowback from Iraq, but that never materialized, and it's really a puzzle in this field because so many things pointed in that direction. You had a U.S. intervention, done in a way that sort of seemed to confirm everything that bin Laden had been saying, about a Western onslaught against Islam, etc. So you had, Western intervention. You had lots of foreign fighters. You had an al-Qaida linked group, etc. Yet very little terrorism spillover in the West, at least, but just 2 or 3 instances that can be linked back to Iraq.
That's interesting. So you might have seen recently in an interview in the New Yorker, President Obama said something to the effect of that al-Qaeda really isn't stronger now than it was before because you can put a Kobe Bryant jersey onto a junior varsity team, but it doesn't make them the Lakers. And what do you think about this? Do you think that the current organizations that are out there are really significantly inferior in some way, ideologically, organizationally, to what we think of as al-Qaeda? Or do you think he's got this wrong? Well,
I think it's not so much about whether they're strong or weak, but where they're operating. And I think he's both right and wrong in the sense that you now have more groups in the Middle East, jihadi groups in the Middle East, and several of them are stronger than anything that you had in 2001. And so, just, in terms of their ability to carry out operations, in their local area. So, as militant groups, many of these are quite strong, but what most of these groups don't do is attack the West. They don't do international operations. So you could say that the jihadi movement is still very strong, perhaps stronger than it was in the late 2000s, but it's less of a threat so far to the West.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you, Thomas Hegghammer, for joining us in the POMEPS conversations, and thank you for tuning in.